Hello viewers, welcome to this special interactive session with Professor Galin Tihanov, who has been with us here at the English and Foreign Languages University for the last 2 weeks as a resource person on the 15th FCT Theory Praxis course being organized by the Forum on Contemporary Theory Baroda in collaboration with the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. And Professor Tihanov has been enlightening the participants of this course on a variety of issues related to the contemporary theory and other special topics like exilic writing, cosmopolitanism and world literatures. It is a pleasure to have Professor Tihanov with us today. Professor Tihanov is the George Steiner Comparative Literature Professor at Queen Mary, University of London. He was also co-director of the Research Institute on Cosmopolitan Culture and Theory at the University of Manchester. Welcome, Professor Tihanov. It's a pleasure to have you with us on this program. And on behalf of the Department of the Indian and World Literatures, the School of Literary Studies, English and Foreign Languages University, I'm delighted to have you on this program because our department has launched a new MA program called Literatures in English, in which the main thrust is on the study of world literatures. And as you happen to be an expert in this area, we would like to have your inputs and your expert comments on a variety of questions related to our program, which I am sure will benefit our faculty and the students on this program. So,
thank you very much for having me. It's really kind of you, and I'm very grateful for your hospitality.
So, it has really been a wonderful time to have you all these days on this campus. And well, I would like to ask you firstly, what according to you is world literature, and what is it about a text that bestows upon it the special status of being world literature? So, this is a basic question.
All basic questions are difficult to answer, and you would find that there is perhaps a mainstream today, an Anglo-Saxon mainstream, that understands by world literature the circulation of texts predominantly in translation beyond the environment in which they are written. And I think this is a very good starting point. It needs some nuancing and some qualifications, but it does capture very well the fact that world literature only exists through the travel of texts and also languages. If we want to understand world literature, I always keep saying this to my students, the way to do so is to ask this first primary question: what happens to language as it travels across borders? And sometimes this is the language of translation, sometimes it is the language of a community which traverses borders and reaches a diaspora, or readers from the diaspora back home. But I'm not entirely sure that there is a set of qualities that make a text part of world literature, because world literature in the predominant understanding, and this goes back even to Goethe, actually undermines this fixed hierarchy of texts according to aesthetic merit. These works don't necessarily need to be masterpieces to be part of world literature, but they need to be able to open a window onto a different culture for a community of readers who share the conventions of another culture. Whether the text that fulfills this function is necessarily of the highest artistic merit or not is perhaps of lesser importance. And when you look at Goethe's experience when he starts thinking about world literature in his old age, one of the prompts for him to do so is reading a Chinese novel, which he knows, and he says so to his private secretary, Eckermann, is far from being the best Chinese novel available. So early on, there is this notion that world literature, in order to sustain this reality of circulation, of transfer, doesn't have to confine itself to texts of extraordinary artistic merit. Yeah? It is more about which texts are better suited to crossing borders and which are less so. And we probably also need to disentangle success from merit, because you can have perfectly well a case of a great work of literature, particularly poetry, that is very difficult to translate and for that reason doesn't travel very well. That doesn't make it a work of a lesser standing. It just means that this circulation would incorporate it with more difficulty.
It might encounter some difficulty in crossing the borders.
Yeah.
So is that what you...
Yeah, and again, some works actually, over time, their ability to cross borders is enhanced or is diminished. This is not a constant. This is not a constant criterion. Yeah. It depends on a really shifting constellation of factors which always have to be carefully studied by students, by scholars, in context and historically.
Yeah. So does the language of origin, that is, in other words, in which a particular text is written originally, as against the context in which it is written and the nation which forms the setting to it, have the major say in deciding the status of a text as world literature? That is, will language have the final word?
There are two questions here. One is about language. The other is whether the nation is empowered to actually compile this list of works that should travel. Yeah. Now, the whole idea of world literature is that the significance of a literary text would actually be a matter for the receiving cultures to decide. Yeah? Just as the example with Goethe and numerous other examples, in China this novel would not be seen as necessarily part of the best achievements of Chinese literature at that time. But it is this novel that proved significant for Goethe. And equally, today, I think nation-states, their instruments of influencing this process are not as strong as they used to be. In other words, the nation-state, the national culture might have produced a particular canon of works, but we might find that works that are not part of this canon are actually more widely read and are proving more influential in other environments. Yeah? Okay, yeah. And the second question, of course, is the question of language. Whether, if I understand
this... For instance, as part of world literature, we are able to access an ancient text as the Epic of Gilgamesh and even the more recent text like My Name is Red of Pomyuk. Only because they are available in English. So is it imperative for a text to be written or available in English in order to make it to be a part of world literature?
Not necessarily, particularly if we think of this historically, because you would find very interesting thinkers on world literature, particularly between the two world wars, who actually lament the demise of world literature because they believe that world literature was, and it was when the West, Europe, wrote and read, the educated elites, in Latin and in Greek. And with the arrival of the nation state and national cultures and competing cultural nationalisms, world literature was supplanted by these bickering national literatures. So look at Sanskrit. The argument has been made very aptly by Pollock that Sanskrit is a language of world literature for about 10 centuries. In the whole of the Indian subcontinent, between the 3rd and the 13th century AD. So the language that is that history actually singles out as best placed to play this role of a conduit, of a mediator, it changes over time. And even now, I would not necessarily say that a work must be translated into English before it becomes part of world literature. This, of course, helps greatly, but world literature actually subsists on the life of cultural zones, which are in dialogue, but which are nonetheless distinctive. And in these cultural zones, different languages have a dominant position.
Yes. So then, is the idea of world literature still largely a Euro-American one, or do you see it gaining more ground in the years to come?
I recently read an article in which I found, through the research of this colleague, that this combination of words, world literature, as early as 1826, which means a year before Goethe, in Mexico, in Spanish. So yes, by now this is largely perceived as a European construct, which begins some 50 years before Goethe, with actually a historian, not a literary scholar, called August Schlözer. But I don't think this idea of world literature ought to be confined to Europe and North America. What needs to happen, in my view, is for us to get access to versions of world literature conceived of in other cultural zones that have a different aesthetic experience, a different cultural tradition, a different set of cultural conventions, a different dynamics. And once these versions of world literature, what would world literature look like from the Indian subcontinent, for example? And India is very well placed to make this crucial contribution to this debate, because of its variety and linguistic heterogeneity, India cannot be easily re-essentialized. We cannot easily fall in the trap of talking of the Indian understanding of world literature. But I think we desperately need the contribution from scholars intimately acquainted with these other non-European, non-Western traditions, in order then to have a credible set of reference points that would enrich and also negotiate the way we think of world literature now, now that this thinking is still pretty much reflecting the sole set of reference points that is available on the table. the Western, and in many ways I would probably venture and say the Anglo-Saxon. And we do need to hear our other voices and to realize that there is no one single world literature. There are world literatures, historically speaking, and also today.
In India, could it be made to happen with a better focus on regional literatures in India?
This is probably one way. The other way would be, we talk about world literature, and that is the Western notion of world literature, as if we actually are in possession of solid knowledge of all major traditions. And with reference to Chinese and Arabic and Persian and Sanskrit, this is probably the case, at least to some extent. But how much do we know, for example, about the literatures of Central Asia? There is very little expertise on this in the Western mainstream, and this is largely a blank page. And so how could we possibly talk about world literature while not being able to identify this entire regional variety? So I think India, China, Russia, because of their historical ties with these regions, would be very well placed to close this gap, to bring these literatures to light, and also through exploring Indian regional literatures, begin to construct a scenario of world literature that is non-Eurocentric, that doesn't have national literatures and national cultures as the scale of reflection and the prism of reflection, but works with large supranational regional prisms or with subnational prisms. That's very important.
Yeah. So could you give us a historical retrospective on the changing definitions of literature over a period of time, and elaborate on how East European literatures fit into the dynamics of redefining or recasting the concept of world literatures, because you seem to have worked quite a lot in the area of East European cultural and intellectual.
This is a wide-ranging and complicated question, because if you look at the European experience, of course the notion of literature, what it comprises and what it doesn't, fluctuates over time. And as late as the 17th century, a good piece of philosophy would perfectly well deserve to be called literature and to be studied as literature, or a piece of autobiography, or essays, Montaigne's or others. There is a tipping point in Europe associated with the second half of the 18th century, where gradually there emerges this notion of literature which insists on literature being a discourse that is autonomous from other discourses. At first, in what we still partly by inertia refer to as the Romantic period, this separation of literature from other discourses goes not as much via language, it still goes via the figure of the writer. The writer is marked out as exceptional. He's not a Philistine. He's not a bureaucrat. He's someone who produces these texts which have no immediate purpose, which have no immediate utility. And literature becomes this social and aesthetic practice which is recognized gradually for its intrinsic value. Yeah? Unlike journalism, unlike sermons in the church, unlike court decisions, only actually fairly late in around World War I do we begin to think of literature as an autonomous specific discourse, also by attaching literariness specifically to language. This is a fairly, chronologically speaking, a fairly late phenomenon. But if you go to China, then you discover that things that from a European perspective would no longer count as literature beyond a certain historical point, because in the European context that would be seen, for example, as examples of didactic writing. Particularly after the 18th century, this would no longer be considered literature in the European mainstream. China preserves this broader notion of literature for longer. And the texts that we would think of didactic and therefore probably not original enough in the sense of not quite seeing the traces, the presence of authorial imagination and originality in these texts. In the Chinese tradition, these texts would be credited as and recognized as literary texts for longer. And there would be no sharp contrast between didactic texts and texts that are grounded in authorial imagination and originality. Similarly, if you go to the Arabic cultural realm, you would find that a lot of what defines whether a text is a literary text or not hinges on criteria drawn purely and primarily from rhetoric. In other words, how sonorous, how beautiful, how symmetrical a text is. And the content, while important, doesn't take precedence. What takes precedence in how you define literature is drawn from this notion of the perfection of expression that are of value precisely because they are inimitable. And all you can strive to achieve is to approximate perfection in how you capture them.